Welcome back to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and today we have another installment in partnership with TPS IL to bring you the news from Israel and the region. A lot has happened since our last news update 2 weeks ago. Donald Trump is officially our 47th president in anticipation of his upcoming inauguration. Hamas and Israel did reach a ceasefire agreement, a deal which would be seen over the course of 3 stages. So we're currently in stage 1, which will be a 6-week stage where hostages will be exchanged for Hamas prisoners or Palestinian prisoners in Israel. Most of these prisoners are terrorists responsible for the death of many, many Israelis. And so the deal has been controversial. 3 girls were released last week. There's an anticipated 4 girls set to be released this Shabbat. So even tomorrow, as soon as tomorrow or this weekend on Saturday. And while we're joyful to see the hostages return home, it does come with a high cost, which is the exchange of prisoners who are terrorists. We also know that the hostage families were pushing for a deal where all the hostages were returned home at once, and that was not realized. So while we're joyful for the girls who did make it home, there's many families who are still waiting for their loved ones to be returned. And so we're going to talk about those polarizing feelings within Israel today on the podcast, as well as the Trump administration's policies, the reversal of sanctions from the former Biden administration already set in motion a few days into his presidency, and what that means for Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship, in addition to what does rebuilding Gaza look like? What is the hope of Palestinians within Gaza, and how are those hopes for a new vision different from that of Israelis and Israel's war aims in Gaza? All of this and more in the upcoming episode. I hope you enjoy. Rachel, welcome back to the Philos Project podcast in partnership with TPS IL. I always enjoy our conversations. Maybe for our audience, you can introduce yourself. And if they haven't seen our past TPS IL episodes, you can introduce your organization too.
Yeah, hi again, and it's always lovely to be here. And I am Rachael Stern, the Director of Operations at TPS IL, the Press Service of Israel. And essentially, we provide the international news with the original footage that we derive from the scene of news events in Israel. We are the only Israeli news agency, so we actually arrive. We have a network of about 450 plus or minus different volunteer photographers and stringers. And every time that there's something that happens in the country, in Gaza, we are on the scene. We take the videos, the coverage, pictures, like stills, and then we attach context articles, and we then relay that to our international partners who send it out to their news outlets. So it's really important to have an Israeli voice on the scene of every news event.
Absolutely. And what I love and appreciate about TPSIL is like the unbiased nature of the news. It's just kind of like that classic journalism of
Hard
like
news, yeah.
hard news, without all of the spin. And obviously this conflict is super politicized. So we're really grateful for all the work that you guys do. Today we have a lot to talk about. In our last episode, we were kind of anticipating a hostage deal, the incoming Trump administration, and a lot of that has come to fruition since our last conversation. So I think a really great place to start would be talking about the 3 hostages who were returned, the 3 young women. And then I know that there's also anticipation of maybe 4 more young women coming home either tomorrow or this weekend. I don't really have the details on that, but if you could shed some light, that would be great.
Yeah, first, I think what you're saying is really accurate. In terms of, well, what a crazy news week. Let's start off the bat with that. There has been so much that has happened, but I just want to be really clear when we're talking about hostage deal that this is an extension and extortion. And I think Alan Dershowitz put this really, really eloquently when he said that when somebody, when a mother has her child kidnapped from its home and you're doing a deal with a kidnapper, we don't call this, an exchange. No, it's an extortion from a blackmail. And I think that it's really important to really put the emphasis on the fact that Israel has been shoved into a corner that there is no winning. And this is really what we're looking at. Despite that, I will say there have been some very intense emotional, visceral reactions to the release of these hostages. I would say, we were just speaking about this, but in terms of the morale of Israeli society, it's all over the place. But seeing these three women that were returned, which is one of them is her name is Doron Steinbrecher, I believe, Romy Gonen and Emily Damari, all kidnapped from different locations. Steinbrecher was a veterinary nurse. She was abducted from her home in Kfar Gonen was a waitress in Tel Aviv. She went to the Nova Festival, and the three people in the car with her were murdered. The last conversation she had with her mother 470 some days ago was telling them that she was shot, she was bleeding to death, everyone was bleeding to death, and that was the last time she had, yeah, like any kind of connection with her family. Um, and then Damari, the third, was abducted from her apartment in Kfar as well in the youth neighborhood, and she was shot in the hand. And this has become a huge symbol right now throughout the social media in Israel of her, because she did this expression when she was getting out of the car or coming home with her mother, and you can see that she has obviously is missing two fingers. So
Mhm.
they're all, I believe, still currently at the Sheba Hospital for undergoing obviously extensive medical evaluation. But this is big, and this is the beginning, and we'll see what happens. I mean, there's a lot to come, and of course, Hamas took forever to even release the names, and they weren't supposed to release it anyways publicly, and they did, which is just another component of the psychological warfare. I mean, these
Mhm.
poor families. So,
I know.
there's so much, and then as we all saw, anybody who was following this situation was this long, 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 unnecessary drive by with multiple surrounded by all these Palestinians, and you just see the beginnings of a lynch
Mhm.
that these girls had to go through on their way to release.
It was so horrific. I think the young lady whose fingers were missing, I believe it's like her middle and ring finger, but in like an ASL, in American Sign Language, this is like I love you or like love. So I also
Mhm.
thought that was a really powerful image. And I
Right.
also was really struck by the strength of these young women. Obviously, I'm sure there's adrenaline and there's going to be a lot of processing and trauma to work through. But two of the girls, when they FaceTime their families after hugging their mothers, said, I survived, I made it back alive, and were very joyous. And I just like the strength that they had was just really inspiring because, as you mentioned, that video of them being driven through a crowd of plainclothes Palestinians in Gaza chanting, taunting them was really graphic. And I think it kind of points to a larger debate of, what's the line between civilian and combatant in Gaza or those who support Hamas. We don't know, if the plainclothed men are combatants, but there was a lot of people quick to defend, Gazans, saying like not every Gazan supports Hamas. But I thought that the footage was to the contrary, and an example of why you can't negotiate with terrorists, the stronghold that Hamas ideologically has on the larger population. And I think if it wasn't for those Hamas militants, they would have been, I'm sure, lynched or killed in the street. It was absolutely horrific just to see a huge crowd kind of taking joy in one last opportunity to just terrorize these young women. It was absolutely
Yes.
disgusting. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and not just the fact that they were also held, of course, within UNRWA
Mm-hmm.
buildings, but also, you see. I think for me, one of the most revolting components personally is the Red Cross
Mm-hmm.
being just this absolutely nothing. Clearly have not touched or even been able to access them whatsoever, but yet they become the chauffeur service.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and seeing even that Hamas has dictated the entire situation to the point where they were off record, off camera, driving around throughout the streets, putting on this big affair, which we'll speak about. But it was just really a declaration of victory for them. And even if,
Mm-hmm.
of course, this is comes at a loss for them because they've been severely, well, from what we understand, um, between morale and also just in general losing obviously the heads of their brigades, etc., affected and impacted by this war this last year and a bit. Still, their intention is to obviously come off as having the upper hand in this deal. And again, this is just the first step. We have about um many more terrorists that we'll speak about being released, and this is just the three first hostages to come. So we're looking at about Saturday, we're assuming, the next section or step or whatever of this exchange. And And yeah, we don't even know if they're going to be releasing life or death. We
Mhm.
don't have protocol, speaking of which, for what's going to happen if they do hand back, let's say, body bags,
Wow.
and what that's going to look like for Israeli society. Everybody is so emotionally drained as it is from this situation, and then not knowing what's to come. We're just we're on edge, I would say, largely. But in terms of the Gazans and the Palestinians and the integration of Hamas, it's so extensive, and you can see by these videos that have come out of Gaza from Sunday, it is just intertwined within society, and it's really near impossible to discern what's the difference.
Mm.
Civilian clothing, armed clothing, it doesn't matter. You have gunmen left, right, and center, and if not, you have women walking the streets, you know, um, throwing up symbols, congratulating them, celebrating, handing out sweets.
Yeah. We'll talk about in a second the reception or the really polarized emotions that Israelis have towards this deal. But I think just kind of continuing the conversation on Hamas and Palestinians in Gaza, um, there was a lot of cheering, and I was actually in Israel when the deal was reached, or the rumors of the deal being reached kind of broke, and a lot of my colleagues and I were searching the news, and there was a lot of Palestinians excited about the ceasefire. And I kind of assumed it was because, they wanted a reprieve in the fighting. They were
Mhm.
hopeful of some change. But I also think there's a large segment of Palestinians who see this as legitimizing their war aims, legitimizing what happened on October 7th. I think that was an understanding that slowly unraveled for me. And I'll actually play this clip um, from y'all's reporting um, of them chanting.
إنها مستمرة بإذن الله لتحرر آخر جندي صهيوني في بلادنا المقدسة بإذن الله.
So for those who are listening, it's a bunch of militants, cheering or, praising God that they have now been given the chance to kill every Zionist soldier in their holy war, essentially is the summary of some of their celebration. Can you speak a little bit to, how this deal might be viewed by the Palestinian or the Gazan perspective, or sorry, excuse me, the Hamas perspective, to be legitimizing their terror and almost capitulation to their initial aims on October 7th?
Yeah, I think that very poignant what you just said. It's total capitulation. I think that this gives them not just legitimacy, but they've also been able to weaponize, um, you know, what they at least view as an Israeli kneeling to their behalf. And really, I think just a larger understanding that, hey, you steal people, you rape, torture, and murder them, and in exchange, you get what you want.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we began this war by and large saying that we don't negotiate with terrorists. And then now, a year and months later, we're understanding that there's far more diplomatic measures that there's no choice. Like I said from the beginning, we've just been backed into a corner. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that while Israeli morale and larger society is necessary to see these people back and to see people reunited with their families and feel those feelings and feel like there's a collective society that actually is looking out and prioritizes the security of its individuals and civilians and citizens and that being said, we're seeing this footage, and I mean, I think we can only understand that Hamas taken this as a huge win between their telegrams, between their various different news agencies within Gaza. Again, there is no free press in Gaza, so everything is just an arm or some kind of extension of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and the various different semi political fronts that they have. It's just very clear to us that this is a win. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
optimistic that maybe like the tide will change. But then again, they're receiving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very dangerous terrorists back that will essentially allow them to regroup as they wish. So we'll
Mm-hmm.
see.
Yeah, and I think from, my perspective too, it is joyous that these hostages have come home and, there's the hope that this deal won't be spoiled and that you'll see the return of all of the remaining hostages. But also I think something to emphasize is that it's a really fragile deal and it's happening in small incremental stages and there's the possibility for spoiling to happen at any stage. I think this first stage is going to be approximately 6 weeks.
Mhm.
Um, and there'll be negotiations for, the second phase, which would include the withdrawal of the IDF in Gaza around day, I think 16 or 18 is when those negotiations will
Mhm.
start. But there's just so much room for both sides to either back out. I know Hamas, even on Thursday, when it was supposed to be voted through the Knesset, had temporarily, said that the terms were actually weren't favorable to them and they
Oh yeah,
weren't going to agree to it. And then it
yeah.
finally went through. So there's at any point this deal, I can even call it a deal, um, could be spoiled. But something else that really stuck out to me was that this deal has kind of been the same deal that's always been on the table since right after October 7th, which, had always really been unfavorable to Israel. I think the initial kind of exchange or hostage to prisoner ratio was going to be, hopefully all of the hostages returned for some 1,500 Palestinian prisoners. Now there's some 33, maybe 34 hostages left for 1,000 um, or so Palestinian Hamas prisoners in Israel. So the deal largely and that, hostage to prisoner ratio doesn't favor Israel in the slightest. And something else I really want to talk about is, who is being released. So there's some really horrific murderers and terrorists who will be returned to Gaza in this exchange. You guys have a really great article on it highlighting. Um, sorry, this is the wrong article. Highlighting, who those prisoners are, and here are some of them. So I don't know if you can speak to, who they are. Scrolling, we can even see here at the top. Mohammed Wardi is a Hamas member who sent suicide bombers to blow themselves up in Jerusalem. Buses, those attacks killed 45 people. So, there's also an emotional reaction to the return of these hostages, as I understand from Israelis who have lost family members because of these terrorists. So that kind of speaks to the polarized, emotions with this deal. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one thing that's important to note too is, like you said, this is a huge concern within the larger security of the Israeli public, because these are not just these are incredibly serious offenses. These are suicide bombers from the many different intifadas that we've had here in Israel. These were terrorists that blew themselves up on buses, returned, went back to prison, when were rearrested, and we have people on life terms, left and right and center, that attempted organized bombings, successful ones. These are terrorists that have killed more, like on the upwards of 40 people often, and re-releasing them into society, whereas maybe they're not going back into, Judea, Samaria, West Bank area. They're still being released back into a world that is waiting for them with open arms. And I think that that in itself has really colored this exchange, because nobody understands what the larger picture is going to look like. Now, I wish there was some creative way to be able to to deal with them, um, with a time lapse of some sort. But right now, as far as we're concerned, they're just kind of being let out, and obviously it's a huge security risk on behalf of Israel. But I think that many people are holding the notion that if we can just get our hostages back, we don't have that bargaining tool anymore. We can do
Mhm.
what we need to by all means necessary, and then because we're now supported by the current administration, of the United States, it allows for us to have a lot more legitimacy in our and security within our elective goals within Gaza. So there is that, like, their protection. There's that reassurance, I think, but it's very timid, and a lot is resting on this. And I think that we see this even within this week, how there's been such an uptick right now in the calls for terrorist attacks. And also, we saw a terrorist attack 2 days ago in Tel Aviv,
Mm.
actually across the street from my house. So
Wow. Was anyone killed in that terrorist attack or?
there was multiple people stabbed. And it was
Oh, actually, yeah.
an American and a Moroccan who had received his visa for the States and was in Israel
Well, yeah, I
visiting.
had actually just been there, and my whole group on our most recent PLI trip had just been in that area, and then we saw that the attack had happened. Um, I guess the question I want to ask you as an Israeli, and with the most sensitivity as I can have towards the situation, is what are kind of the larger feelings? I know, as you said, and it has always been Israel's war aim since the beginning of this conflict to, bring the hostages home. But is there a question around, what cost? Because then now you also have the justice for those who have been killed by many of these terrorists. Um, what are, some of those complex emotions like as an Israeli? And is that a controversial debate within Israeli society and within the government? How has, the larger Israeli population reacted?
I think larger Israeli it's interesting because across the spectrum, I think there is more or less a similar sentiment, which is they're evil, they don't deserve what they're getting, they inflicted a Holocaust upon us. However, what's more critical when it comes to value of human life? And I think that this is a very existential question that every Israeli has been asking themselves. What is the value of human life? How can we continue on as a cohesive society with accepting and the notion that we have left people behind that did nothing? They were
Mm,
innocent. They went to music festivals. They were in their homes on a Saturday morning at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning. They were killed, shot, dismembered, taken from their homes and stuck in tunnels and in international institution, buildings, lacking food, being potentially sexually molested, like all of these components. How can a country stand by and say, we will protect our civilians if they were unable to do so? And how can we
mm,
continue with that realization that we are not secure? And that if we get hurt, maybe nobody's coming to get us. So I
mm,
think that fractures society just as much. However, on the other hand, I think it's a genuine security threat to be releasing hundreds and hundreds of very, very, very dangerous terrorists. And as we see, they have every intention to continue to inflict October 7th upon us. They are very clear. They have basically been perpetuating an entire worldwide social media presence to be able to cultivate this, attract more, and we see a lot of shaheedims and a lot of lone wolves that are going after on their own, um, and perpetuating also the violence. So it's just there is no good answer. I wish I could tell you what like the larger Israeli society thinks, but I think that the moment when you see these girls with their families, it's
mm,
impossible not to get emotional because October 7th was just so there's no words really to
mm,
describe the fear and the devastation. However, it feels a little bit lighter when you see, the reunification of families. On the other hand, there has been many, many soldiers that have lost their lives in pursuit of defending this country. Brave, incredible human beings that sacrificed themselves for the larger good of the Israeli society's security. And it's like, what do their deaths mean then if we're just going to
mhm,
push out a bunch more, right? These very people that inflicted danger upon us.
mm. Yeah, it's such a complex moral like debate and conflict, and but like you
A
said, like seeing the
conundrum.
videos,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a conundrum. There's no winning, and bringing part of my job is I bring many Christian young thought leaders to Israel, and everyone has a different idea on the conflict and how to solve it, but it almost feels like this unsolvable conundrum, as you said, and there really is no winning completely with any of these outcomes. I also think just revisiting, what this means for Gaza. So obviously, it poses a hope,
Yeah.
or it presents Israel with a hope that the hostages will be returned and provide closure. But it also presents a security dilemma. Obviously, Israel's two war aims were first to bring the hostages home, and then second to destroy and delegitimize Hamas. And so this temporarily, at least, kind of prevents Israel from achieving that larger war aim. Um, Are there any talks about, like, what a
You know,
next day looks like? What did you say?
I said hopefully not.
Yeah, yeah, hopefully not. But is there any kind of debates within larger Israeli society or, politically on, what to do, in Gaza? Like, obviously, all these terrorists are being returned and they'll, likely fill, the role that many of the top Hamas terrorists who have been killed in this war, they'll step into those shoes. So is there any kind of debates on next day or, how is Hamas rebranding themselves? I know that they've also been trying to rebrand themselves with the announcement of this deal.
Yeah, so 100%. I think then that we really phone in a friend in this regard. And I think that the fact that we've seen already President Donald Trump eliminate UNRWA, and really speak on behalf of the reduction of, well, first of all, there's ample humanitarian supplies. As we all know, COGAT government organization has illustrated the amount of humanitarian aid that's just been sitting there withering away, or the amount that Hamas takes advantage of and then resells. I'll just give you a little bit of data points. At one point, 85% of all trucks entering the strip were hijacked. And we've also understood that the distribution lines are so intense that they pretty much not just exclusively reach Hamas, but then they're receiving money, food, and vouchers almost exclusively. Hamas pays the gangs that they're utilizing to take upon, which is, again, a testament to the fact that everybody's intertwined, $10,000 a month, which is an incredible salary for this particular situation. So we're seeing, if we can cut these lines of not just humanitarian aid but also international funding, I think that that also will just immediately start to grind things to a little bit of a halt. But those are the initial goals as far as I'm
Yeah.
seeing. And also, obviously, there's a lot of damaged infrastructure. So I think maybe at some point it will fall on international agencies or countries, hopefully, that will take advantage also and see this as an opportunity to step in. Hopefully, Bahrain and the UAE and more westernized, also religious, like more fundamentalist, like countries will take charge and try to help Gazans redeem themselves.
Mm. Yeah, I know you guys had posted an article about Hamas trying to rebrand as like the provider of nope, I don't know what happened. The provider um for humanitarian aid, which is so like ironic because Hamas is supposed to be the provider for Gaza. They were voted in to do that very thing, but instead of building legitimate infrastructure, they've just built terror infrastructure. And when we talk about like the humanitarian crisis, as you were saying, they employ gangs to hijack or raid the humanitarian caravans coming through, but they also sell the aid, which is given to them, to
Mhm.
Palestinians in Gaza.
Crazy
So
prices.
yeah, it's crazy. So it's a manufactured humanitarian crisis because they're given ample food and aid to provide for the needs of Gazan Palestinians. And so I think what most people in the international community don't understand is that this is then just weaponized against the Palestinian people within Gaza. And something from my recent trip that I was really struck by is first, there's a huge youth population in the Gaza Strip.
Oh yeah.
But they really have no hope. And so I think that's why, harkening back to the videos we initially showed, a lot of them do support Hamas because it really is the only, either solution that they see or they've been radicalized because of the absence of hope for a future. And it's a vicious cycle. So as you said, with the deal, it's a conundrum. What to do in Gaza is also a conundrum. But it is interesting seeing, Hamas seize upon the opportunity through this deal to quote unquote rebrand when that's exactly what um, they should be they should be doing.
I think.
Um,
Mhm.
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll let you continue.
No, 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 you're good. Go for it.
I just think that this is something that we've seen pretty much throughout, I would say, the last 80 more plus years, especially with, for instance, the institution of the Muslim Brotherhood as like portraying itself and parading itself as this quasi like socioeconomic support group, mafia type groups and everything like that, they form themselves, on the basis of being socialist trade unions. And
Mm.
I think that that allows for them also to hold reign on the societies that they wish to entrap, essentially, because they perpetuate their own problems, but also because they provide for the civilians also a lot of respite. They give security in exchange. It's kind of like reminiscent of also like the favelas and stuff like that in Brazil and these different gang groups. It's like, okay, but meanwhile, they are also perpetuating the violence. They are also providing for anybody who's within their society protection, um, jobs, not really within, more or less, but and I think we see this being the pervasive issue. So
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah,
just a self like just continues the cycle.
a cycle. Yeah, absolutely. It's something else. Like when we go to Israel with like Christian delegations, I bring is that this has been a conflict and an issue for generations and generations, and it is just a manufactured vicious cycle to perpetuate the interest of Hamas, and that's something I wish more
Absolutely.
people really understood. We've also, seen an uptick in terrorism, as you mentioned, in Tel Aviv. In our last podcast episode, we had talked about just like the increase of terrorism across Israel, and we've seen, the call for terrorism by Hamas, which does have support within the West Bank. And so I know Israel's been targeting terror groups in Jenin. Can you talk a little bit about that? If there's growing, widespread concern within Israel on maybe the potential threat from terror coming out of the West Bank?
Yeah, this is our biggest concern as of late. I would
Mm.
definitely say that because after the Palestinian Authority has withdrawn recently, Israel has 100% intensified our operations against the terror groups in the area, leading to a huge, I mean, the withdrawal has led to a huge power vacuum. And we see that. And we also have seen predominantly within Jenin and the different West Bank area, we just see time and time again lone wolf operations. So this is incredibly dangerous because obviously more difficult to track.
Mhm.
And now there has just been a huge uptick of arrests, of strikes. And today, even there was like a 4 hour standoff leading to a bunch of arrests. It's very dangerous. It's very I would say our focal point right now in terms of internal security issue, and hopefully we'll see a little bit of quieting, especially as we see also our ceasefire in the north coming to an end recently, and then who knows what's going to happen with Gaza. I think that we're going to be seeing we're going to be hearing, feeling, and seeing a little bit more action in the coming days. I hope not, but this just looks like the reality.
Mm.
So,
I'm also curious about, the role that the current Trump administration, the newly sworn in administration, is going to play in, trying to help Israel with all these different security calculations from all the different fronts that they're fighting, both in Lebanon, as you mentioned, the West Bank, Gaza, maybe Syria as well,
mm-hmm.
Iran, questions on Iran and, how strong they
Yep.
are. Um, I do think it's probably on the docket, or like whispers I've heard in DC, is that it is, Trump's objective for some sort of a regime change in Iran, or some brokering some sort of transition there. Who knows if that's even, possible. That's a wonderful idea. But is there kind of a collective thought in Israeli society on Trump, being sworn in? Is this like a renewed breath, of hope? I know that obviously Trump's a polarizing figure. I think now he's moved more mainstream in the United States. Like I voted for Trump in 2016 and it was like so taboo. But now, saying I voted for Trump, I still get unfollows on Instagram, but like people don't have the same visceral reaction. But I think no matter
Interesting.
where you sit politically, he mentioned the hostages even in his first speech when he was sworn in.
Oh yeah, they were behind him
um,
in his
yeah,
inauguration.
it
Hmm.
it was it
Powerful.
was really powerful to see. And also, not to make this like political, but Biden and Harris, who were standing directly behind him, were the last people to stand up with the standing ovation. It's like they almost realized that like they needed to stand up. So I think it points to the political nature of the last administration and how they politicized Israel. So is there hope that this new administration is going to at least equip Israel or partner with them in their war aims and in their security aims?
Oh, tons. I think
Mm.
that there was a collective sigh of relief when it came to just like first day tasks when it coming to decreasing the funding for UNRWA being a fundamental point of Hamas being really their cash flow. It is in. not just that, the harboring of hostages, the intrinsic like integration of UNRWA workers as Hamas like employees as well, just all of it. It seems like this was a fundamental move in the task to really decay Hamas at its root. And the fact that this was done really day one as a priority, I think is a testament to the fact that this new administration is really like behind us. I do think that there is a bit of a question regarding, the pushing Israel into a deal. But we'll see, because ultimately, if this eventually long term benefits us, and we do have the backing of the United States armory, weaponry, and finances, I think that there is nothing that we can't accomplish in terms of the goals really of the war preceding October 7th. But also not just that, I think like the release of besides the re-evaluation of all this foreign aid between the United Nations and UNRWA and the Hague and every of all of this like reevaluation. Also, just the sanctions between individuals in Judea Samaria, these residents that were accused of violence that really were not embedded in anything on behalf of the prior administration. I think that that just also raises morale within Israeli society that that is critical, because it provides us the opportunity to it's like a justification. And I think that when you don't have this recognition of, oh, okay, you've been put into this war, not engaged in it because you wanted to. Oh, and there's a very vocal stance that's dominant. Um, it gives validation, and I think that that's needed at this moment. And I think that that is the sentiment right now.
That's
But we'll
great.
see.
Yeah, because I was in Israel when he was elected too, and I just remember like being so anxious all day, and obviously the time difference. Like I woke up to find out that he had won, and
Mhm.
it was interesting because I have a lot of Israeli friends who are not like conservative or right wing at all, and they were also hoping for that outcome. And so I'm excited to see what happens. I was also excited. Something that I'm passionate about speaking out against is, right wing anti Semitism in the form of isolationism and kind of
Mhm.
blaming, Israel as this, international Jewish cabal. So I was
Mhm.
really encouraged to see Trump, speak to just like the larger party about Israel upon
Absolutely.
his being sworn in. So it was also a lot of morale, at least for me, for my party, to him signaling to the maybe fringes that Israel was an important ally,
Him
and they haven't
signaling in
moved
general.
the
And
needle.
and
Yeah.
and don't is not, it's not a valid um I think response to an international war.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm excited to see what happens, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of reporting to
I'm
do
sure
with
there will be
all
a lot
the new developments. Yeah, because even in just in 1 week, there's been so much news. So
going on.
I'm sure next time we'll, God willing, be talking about more hostages being returned. But I'll give you, if you want any closing remarks, or if there's anything that you want the audience to follow TPSIL's work and how they can either sign up or subscribe or, follow all the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a YouTube account where you can view a lot of the footage that we upload. Our website, some articles are open, but majority are really we're B2B for foreign news agencies. However, if you're interested in really supporting our mission and our day-to-day operations, just being able to get our photographers in the places that they need to be, we are essentially, going up against the multitude of different Palestinian news agencies with questionable reputations and misreporting antics. And then we also have, the three main news agencies, which is AP and Reuters, which have been also and AFP, which have we've seen like throughout the last year and bit very integrated also within questionable reporting tactics. So we just really find that it's critical. It's critical to be out there. It's critical to be on the scene and to be able to get our news to the world. So if you also believe that, we'll have a donate link. And yeah, supporting, I think, these organizations that really need to exist and really need to be perpetuating the accurate, hard news, no bias internationally. It's critical for us to take hold of the international narrative and the international bias against Israel, which perpetuates also international anti-Semitism and violence. So really critical. And thank you, Dominique, for having us, and thank you to the Philos Project.
Yeah, absolutely. I always enjoy our conversations. They're some of my favorites. I will see you in our next episode. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Philos Project podcast in partnership with TPS IL. Both the Philos Project and TPS IL are nonprofits, and if you feel led to give to offerings such as this podcast and this partnership, I will leave a giving link to both organizations in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Like always, please like, comment, and subscribe to the Philos Project channel, and I will see you in our next episode. Bye.